grateful to be able to be here today. Especially recording, so I'm going to hit got it and then X everything out. We have a couple of housekeeping pieces first before we get into this and before doing a quick introduction of Erica. So we begin with our round acknowledgement as we always do. So let me play that.
While we gather at San Jose State University, we are gathered on the ethno-historic tribal territory of Tiatmen Ohlone, who were direct ancestors of the lineages enrolled in the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, and who were missionized into Mission Santa Clara, San Jose, and Dolores, the lands on which San Jose State University is established and continues to be of significance to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We also recognize that the ancestors of the Muwekma Ohlone constructed and maintained the 3 Bay Area missions. Our campus extends to surrounding areas that held Tupentaka Traditional Roadhouse, which were once located at the historic Lope Ñigo Nangran Rancho Pozolmi y Positas de las Animas, Little Wells of Souls, and also Marcelo Pio and Cristobal's land grant Rancho Ulistac, which were places of celebration and religious ceremonies, as well as nearby ancestral heritage shell mounds that served as the tribe's traditional cemetery sites and territorial monuments. San Jose State University also desires to honor the military service of the Muwekma men and women who have honorably served overseas during World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and who are still serving in the United Armed Forces today. Thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, so a couple of quick announcements. This will be live. We're out there in the world. We're recording it. It'll eventually be posted to our website. If you have questions, the best place to put those are in the Q&A. For those who are physically, we have hands that we can raise now and things like that, which is neat. If you remember, that's what you do when you want to ask a question in person. So just note those things. And of course, I have to thank all the various sponsors. The Office of Provost, their team there, always chipping in, the King Library folks, who not only sponsor this event, but make it work, and they're an amazing group. The School of Music and Dance, the Division of Research and Innovation, and the Spartan Bookstore have all come together today to make this possible. So with that, I think, if I remember correctly, I now turn to the quick introduction. So Dr. Erica is an amazing scholar who oversees, is director of the IRF Center for Beethoven Studies. And every time I talk about this center, everybody goes, how did it end up at San Jose State? That's a whole other question, but it's an amazing collection, an amazing opportunity for us to lead in a particular space that you might not expect every day. She obviously also holds appointment in the School of Music and Dance. She received her PhD in musicology from the University of Manchester in 2013, as well as a master's in musicology and a bachelor's degree in musicology. She's held a number of prestigious fellowships, as well as completed a number of interesting and various post-certificate programs and so forth. Her monograph, The Viennese Ballroom in the Age of Beethoven, was released from Cambridge last year. 2022. And she has numerous publications, as well as being invited to speak on such prestigious channels like the BBC.
Be here. Thank you for the introduction. I'm really excited for this opportunity to share a bit about my research. The talk today is mostly derived from my book, which was published last year, and which was something that took me several years and took me on a few trips to Vienna, which was a very nice thing to do. So my research focuses on Central European music and dance, specifically centered in the city of Vienna, from around 1800, the decades around the turn of the 19th century. That was a very important period in both realms. In music, it was the period of Beethoven, one of the most influential artists in the Western tradition. And in dance, it was the opening of the public ballroom. So the idea that all people of different classes could come together, anyone who could pay a ticket could come and dance together. So that shows a new way of society being organized. So both of these traditions have received a lot of attention in their respective fields, but I found that there hasn't been much overlap between them. So musicologists don't tend to worry too much about ballroom dancing, and scholars of dance don't often refer to people like Beethoven and Haydn because they didn't write that much music for dancing. But I found that looking at the two of them separately throws up some really interesting things. It teaches you more about music and dance, but also about the culture and society that generated both of these things. And it also tells you a bit, I think, about what those two disciplines tend to do. So musicologists tend to be very detail oriented, get, drill down into one particular issue without maybe thinking about what's going on around it. Dance historians like to talk about the big picture, and sometimes I feel like detail actually can complicate those big pictures. And so that's the kind of approach that I've taken in this book, and which I'll be talking about in this talk. My talk today is about a historic moment that occurred on the 2nd of October, 1814 in Vienna, the capital of what was then the Habsburg Empire that extended over most of Central Europe. This moment took place shortly after Napoleon Bonaparte's French Empire had been defeated by a coalition of other European nations. Napoleon had been forced to abdicate. Everything all right? Napoleon had been forced to abdicate and was now in exile on the island of Elba. And the Bourbon monarchy had been restored in France for the first time since the French Revolution, more than 2 decades earlier. My historic moment was part of the opening ball at the Congress of Vienna, where music and dance played a role in shaping the power dynamics in the new social order in post-Napoleonic Europe. The Congress of Vienna, there we go, brought together representatives from Europe's leading powers after Napoleon's defeat in order to redraw the map of Europe, to restore a balance of power, and hopefully to prevent future Republican and revolutionary uprisings. Their goal was to restore the old order of pre-revolutionary Europe, and they were somewhat successful for a short period. The period from 1815, the end of the Congress, until the 1848 uprisings across Europe is known in German language scholarship as the Restoration period, indicating the restoration of the political order centered on monarchies rather than republics like Napoleon's France. Besides being a political conference, the Congress was also a spectacular public festival, commemorating the end of almost 2 decades of continual war in Europe. An estimated 100,000 visitors flocked to Vienna to enjoy the party atmosphere, and travel across Europe was now easy for the first time. There was no war, to stop people traveling. So this was a big moment, and a lot of people wanted to be there. Many were lucky enough to participate in the lavish entertainments put on by the Habsburg court, the official hosts of the Congress. The Habsburg entertainments were coordinated by the Prince Chamberlain, Ferdinand von Trautmannsdorf. He received an enormous budget from Emperor France and spent the summer of 1814 planning 3 major events to celebrate the start of the Congress. So the events he came up with were, first of all, a large ball in the Imperial Palace for 8,000 to 10,000 people. Then another ball, slightly smaller, for only 4,000 people. And then a large concert for 4,000 people. So it's all about music and dance, the 2 things that Vienna is most famous for in this period. You'd think a large concert would be a nice opportunity to showcase Beethoven, but nope, they chose Handel, who'd been dead for more than 60 years. So no Beethoven, unfortunately. So these 3 events, the 2 balls and the concert, eventually took place on the 3 consecutive Sundays in October, the first 3 weeks of the Congress. And the idea was that was the festival. Great, 3 events, now we're going to do politics. But actually, the events were so well received and so popular that the court just kept going and adding more and more events. And the more events they added, the more kind of hastily organized they were. So for instance, on the 18th of October, they organized a massive outdoor military festival in the Prater, which included a religious ceremony and a banquet served to all 14,000 members of the Vienna garrison. And this was put together on just 2 weeks' notice. Another late addition to the calendar was a grand carousel. This was a medieval tournament featuring jousting and all kinds of equestrian displays, which took place in the Winter Riding School in Vienna. If you go to Vienna now, you can go and see the Lipizzaner horses, the very famous horse displays. That was in the Winter Riding School. So that took place on the 23rd of November. It was supposed to be a one-off, but it was so popular that they immediately repeated it twice in the next 10 days. And all of these were for thousands of people and involved a huge collaborations with music and dance and all kinds of crazy things. So these were the official entertainments, but throughout the Congress, there were balls on an almost nightly basis all over the city that catered to visitors of all classes. Vienna in this period had more than 50 dancing venues. Some of them had ballrooms large enough to hold several thousand people. The most prestigious was the Imperial Ballrooms in the Imperial Palace, which had been open to the public under Joseph II for public balls at the end of the 18th century. So a typical ball during the ball season might host 1,500 people, 2,000 people, and this would happen all through Carnival. The most popular dance in Vienna at this period was the waltz, and many visitors to Vienna experienced waltzing for the first time because the waltz was still considered scandalous in some other parts of Europe, but particularly Great Britain. So Congress dance culture got a reputation for being racy and hedonistic, kind of pleasure-seeking. And the endless balls that took place during the Congress were even blamed for the slow progress of diplomatic proceedings because the diplomats were spending so much time dancing that they didn't make much progress. In fact, the proceedings dragged on for more than 8 months. They didn't wrap it up until June 1815. So even today, the Congress of Vienna is sometimes referred to as the Dancing Congress. Great big political conference, but also just a very famous party. The popularity of Vienna's ballroom dance culture at the Congress had political significance besides merely offering entertainment to the participants. For a start, there's stories about diplomacy actually happening in ballrooms, so in the kind of quasi-informal environment of the ball, there's still politics being done. But on another sense, the political negotiations at the conference were reactionary. So they were about restoring the old order of aristocratic supremacy as if the French Revolution had never happened. But Vienna's ballroom dance culture was shaped by the middle classes and had been since the ballrooms were open to the public in the 1770s. So this is still quite a new culture. It's a public environment. It's kind of the opposite of the old regime with the aristocracy keeping very separate from the masses. So this is a commercial middle class culture and an entertainment culture, and that's what was the dominant culture at the Congress. So dance historians view the rise of middle class dance culture in the 19th century as a symptom of the declining influence of the aristocracy over European culture and society. Until the 18th century, social dance culture had been dominated by the court dances of the aristocracy. The archetypal court dance was the minuet, a couple's dance originating at the court of Louis XIV in France. And the minuet was one of the most widespread dance forms in Europe for at least a century. Dance historians sometimes refer to the period 1650 to 1750, the kind of Louis XIV, 15th period, as the age of the minuet. That label comes from Kurt Sachs's World History of the Dance from 1933, but you find that a lot in dance histories. Minuet dancing exemplified aristocratic refinement. Performing a minuet well needed years of dance instruction and practice. If you want to know what a minuet looks like, Joan Walton and I have a motion capture project in the works. So Joan danced a beautiful minuet and we captured it in 3D so that once we put the music together, we'll be able to show you. But the minuet is a couple's dance. The couple don't really touch each other. They kind of dance around each other. It's quite complicated in the pattern they trace over the floor. And it's very mannered in its gestures. It's much more like ballet than like waltzing. At court balls, minuet dancing also reinforced a social hierarchy that was explicitly based on aristocratic rank. The most important person present, that was the king if he was there, would dance first, and no one else would dance while the king was dancing. So you would watch the most important person dance. Once they're done, the next most important couple get to dance, and so on. So it's not only aristocratic in its gestures, it's also actually enforcing a hierarchy in the actual performance. Well, the dance culture before the French Revolution was the age of the minuet. The 19th century was the age of the waltz. Unlike the minuet, the waltz was a dance you did for pleasure, for your own enjoyment, rather than to show off in front of people who are watching you. It's also very much from the lower classes of society. It actually originated as an Austrian folk dance and was taken up by Vienna's middle classes in the city's new public ballrooms when they opened at the end of the 18th century. By 1800, waltzing was the most popular form of dancing, and the minuet was viewed as being stuffy and outmoded. So in other words, aristocratic culture wasn't fashionable anymore by 1800. So while the diplomats at the Congress of Vienna spent the daylight hours negotiating to restore aristocratic power, at night they were participating in a dance culture shaped by the values of the middle classes. Europe's ruling classes may have succeeded in reasserting aristocratic supremacy in the political arena after defeating Napoleon, but they never regained their supremacy in the realm of social dance. But the Congress of Vienna didn't spell the end of aristocratic influence in dance culture. The Congress organizers put as much thought into planning the official festivities as they did to the diplomatic negotiations. And they found ingenious ways of harnessing the new dance culture to their political advantage. This brings me to the historic moment that this talks about. This was all introduction to my moment. The Congress of Vienna officially opened on the 2nd of October, 1814, with a grand ball at the Imperial Palace. 10,000 people attended, and the ball took place across 3 different ballrooms. Each had their own orchestra and dancing happening. And so they were all within the palace complex, including the riding school, which had been turned into a ballroom. So that's what you're looking at now. Tickets to the ball had been distributed by a lottery system during the summer. So it was open to the public, but only 10,000 tickets were available. Those lucky enough to win a ticket experienced one of the most lavish parties in history. The riding school alone was illuminated with around 7,000 candles, decorated with silk hangings of silver and white, silver and blue rather. And the small ballroom in the palace had been transformed into an orangery. Each ballroom had its own orchestra, and the largest here that you can see, they're in uniform at the far end in the red uniforms, that had 80 people in it, which is enormous for Vienna at the time. The professional orchestras usually had 35, 40 people. So this is a very big orchestra. And guests were served a buffet for 10,000 people on imperial silverware. And a lot of that suspiciously went missing over the course of the evening. If you're interested in what a catering expenses list looks like for 10,000 people, that's it. This is a really, really large piece of paper that I had to unfold and lay out on a whole table. And it's got things like, 20 pigs and 50 geese and, however many barrels of wine. So it really ginormous. And if I remember correctly, about a third of the budget for the whole entertainment went on this banquet. So this was really expensive. So back to my moment. At 11 o'clock, after the ball had already been underway for several hours, a blast of trumpets announced the arrival of the guests of honor. These were the most senior members of the European aristocracy who were present in Vienna for the Congress. The guests entered in a formation of high-powered couples headed by Tsar Alexander I of Russia, who was partnered with the Austrian Empress Maria Ludovica. Behind them were the Austrian Emperor of France, who was partnered with the Russian Tsarina Elizabeth. Behind them were the King of Denmark and the Queen of Bavaria. Behind them, the King of Prussia and the Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna of Russia, and then more and more couples in descending rank, aristocratic rank, all from Europe's ancient aristocratic dynasties. Their grand entrance took the form of a polonaise, a processional ballroom dance performed by a column of couples who walk in step to music in a quick triple meter. When they entered, the orchestras in all three ballrooms struck up a newly composed polonaise by Joseph Eibler. He was a distinguished court composer who had been a contemporary of Mozart's and who composed most of the religious music for Habsburg religious ceremonies. So he was one of the court employees, and he was tasked with writing music for this occasion. So this is Eibler's polonaise. The royal guests polonaised their way around the entire ballroom complex to Eibler's music. They repeated the tour several times before taking their place on a raised platform in the Winter Riding School. Eibler's music survives only in piano transcription, which is, there's a print version of it in the Austrian National Library, which you're looking at here, but originally it would have been performed by that orchestra of 80 people. It sounds like this. So that's the A section. There's then a B section. It's very cheery, right? It's lively, upbeat music. So imagine all of those emperors polonaising around the ballroom. So this polonaise is the historic moment that's worth focusing on. Because it tells us something about how the Congress organizers used music and dance to support their political agenda. It also complicates the broader view of the Congress of Vienna in the history of social dancing. The dance culture is usually associated with this racy, waltzing, kind of hedonistic culture. And the Congress undoubtedly played a role in making the waltz socially acceptable in other parts of Europe for the first time. But it was the polonaise that set the tone for the official Congress festivities, and in ways that were to have lasting significance. One of the most important aspects of the sovereign's polonaise was the fact that it was performed only by the royal guests. Although there were 10,000 people present, the public didn't participate. Instead, they were the bystanders as they watched the monarchs dance past them. This obviously points back to the courtly dance culture of the previous century, where those of the highest aristocratic rank danced while everyone else watched. So it's focusing attention on the aristocratic superiority. Dance, and especially the polonaise, was an ideal way of spotlighting the presence of so many powerful individuals who were being seen together in public for the first time in history. Everything about the polonaise was designed to focus attention on the royal guests, from the newly composed music to the carefully choreographed tour of all three ballrooms, taking them past all 10,000 members of the public. Unsurprisingly, press coverage of the ball reported extensively on the grand polonaise. So even people who weren't present could read about the spectacular arrival of the royals. One newspaper reported that the public were in transports at seeing their sovereigns up close. So this carefully choreographed dance was a calculated move from the conference organizers to highlight aristocratic superiority, even in the context of a public ball, which is technically mixed class, so the royals and the middle classes are all there together. But putting this dance at the centerpiece reinforced the aristocratic supremacy of the rulers. The Polonaise was also a particularly good choice because it represented something novel and vaguely exotic for the Viennese. Vienna's social dance culture in this period centered on waltzes and country dances, but the Polonaise wasn't yet a standard ballroom dance. The Polonaise, as the name suggests, is Polish, and it was popular at the Russian court. It was a particular favorite of Tsar Alexander, and it was due to Alexander's influence that it was introduced at the Congress of Vienna. Although the dance was new, it was so simple that anyone could pick it up right away. And with its lively music, the Polonaise was also bound to appeal to popular taste. As you can imagine, the court lost no time in publishing the music and making this something that was available. So the music became kind of like a theme music of the conference. There's published reminiscences by someone who was present on the 2nd of October who said that Polonaise music got the nickname Alexander's favorite Polonaise. So this is Scal's reminiscences here. The court then published the music through their own official court publishers. So you could go out and buy Eibler's music and you could take it home. This was apparently a successful venture because other publishers started to kind of copycat. And there was all kinds of Alexander's favorite dances that you could buy during the Congress of Vienna. So there was Alexander's favorite march, written by Friedrich Starke, who was just an entrepreneurial publisher and composer who wanted a bit of the Alexander's dance action. And all kinds of things were published throughout the conference. So you could buy variations on Alexander's march, for instance, published for piano, or there's a set of waltzes based on Alexander's favorite march. So there's just, it's like a real commercial opportunity for publishers at the Congress. But this all plays into the court's political aims, which is to kind of put this out there, make this dominant in popular culture. So the Sovereign's Polonaise turned out to be one of the most memorable aspects of the ball on the 2nd of October. It was probably meant to be a one-off, just to introduce the guests at the first ball. But it sparked a craze for Polonaise dancing that lasted for the rest of the Congress. Court documents show that Polonaises were a last-minute addition to the music performed at a private ball on the 13th of October, a little under 2 weeks after the first ball. 2 days before that ball, Trautmannsdorf, our conference organizer, sent special instructions to the court's most senior music official, saying that the orchestra must perform polonaises, as well as minuets and waltzes, which apparently didn't need any special instruction. Then on the 11th of November, the Austrian representative, Prince Metternich, hosted a private ball in his own palace, and apparently that included nothing but polonaising and waltzing. So from polonaising not having been known to suddenly that's all anyone wants to dance. Metternich for that ball even hired the Imperial Ballroom Orchestra and got them to perform the same music as the 2nd of October ball. Despite being new to Congress, to Viennese dance culture, the Polonaise soon became the signature dance of Congress balls. Every public ball that was attended by members of European royalty now had to include a Polonaise for the sovereigns to make their grand entrance. On the 10th of November, the court hosted another public ball, basically a repeat of the 2nd of October ball for 10,000 people. They did it again in November, again taking place over all 3 ballrooms. The writer Carolina Pichler was there, and she wrote in her diary later, "Masked ball at riding school in evening, some 8,000 people. Following an admirable custom, the rulers for an hour and a half walked through the figures of the Polonaise in the huge riding hall." it's significant that she talks about the Polonaise being an admirable custom. So this was something that wasn't known 6 weeks ago, and now suddenly it's like the tradition everyone knows. This is an example of what the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm called invented tradition. So basically a tradition that appears or claims to be old, but actually is quite recent in origin. The Polonaise involves some of the traditional trappings of courtly culture, choreographed pageantry, a visual spectacle centering on individuals from Europe's ancient dynasties, and a strict enforcement of social hierarchy. So only the monarchs are dancing, everyone else is watching. But it brought these things into the modern realm of the public ball. So this was not at all out of place in a public ball for 10,000 people. So it's bringing these old things into a thoroughly modern 19th century kind of middle class environment, the public ball. This was a very effective way for the conference organizers to make the notion of aristocracy seem relevant in the modern age, while also maintaining a veneer of historical tradition. All of this helped to support their political aims of restoring aristocratic supremacy within the new social order, which is driven by middle-class culture. There's no two ways around that. So the Polonaise was such a successful invented tradition that it took hold in other areas of cultural life besides these public balls. The royal guests liked a Polonaise for their own entertainment at private parties, where it became more like a game than a formal procession. Polonaise dancing was a favorite activity at the palace of the Russian ambassador, Count Andrei Razumovsky, known to Beethoven enthusiasts for being a Beethoven patron. So you would go to Razumovsky's for a party and there would be some Polonaise dancing. And on one occasion, a Polonaise strung out so far through the rooms of the palace that the column's head, led by the Tsar, Alexander, came face to face with the tail, and it fell apart and everyone just fell about laughing. So it's kind of like the absolute signature of Congress culture is now the Polonaise. Of course, the commemorative publications that were printed by the court and then by other commercial publishers made sure that the historic occasion of the sovereign's Polonaise at the Congress of Vienna had a lasting impact in Viennese popular culture. The printed music didn't just commemorate the occasion, it also enabled people to relive it in their own homes, playing the music and remembering the famous moment when they saw their emperors up close. The court organizers cleverly tapped into Viennese dance culture to keep the notion of aristocracy relevant in the city's everyday cultural life. They were evidently successful, judging by the commercial, the sort of springing up of all of these commercial publications, and from the fact that the Polonaise became an established part of Viennese ballroom dance culture that continues to the present day. At the famous opera ball, which happens every year in Vienna during the carnival season, there's a Polonaise that marks the entrance of the debutantes. So everyone stops and watches them come in. The orchestra plays a Polonaise. So that's a tradition that you can trace right back to the Congress of Vienna. And this is always televised to millions of people. The Polonaise at the Congress of Vienna was a smart piece of PR at a moment when Europe's ancient monarchies were trying to reassert their supremacy. Their political power had recently been shaken by the threat of revolutionary uprisings like those in America and France in the 18th century, and the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte, a commoner, to become the most powerful man in Europe. The aristocracy's cultural power was also on the wane, since social life was increasingly shaped by middle-class values and market forces, rather than the traditional authority of the aristocracy. Tapping into the world of popular dance culture enabled Europe's monarchies to reinvent themselves for the post-Napoleonic era in ways that left their mark on the music and dance of the period. Thank you very much.
So I think there's a question up there, but let's start here. Any questions from the audience to begin? I have one to get us started that I'm interested. Does this pick up to this? Do you hear me? Okay, awesome. So I have. Can you talk a little bit more about the political economy that emerges around all of this, like the ways in which the selling of these artifacts and how that starts to circulate and what that means for everyday culture? You know, because I think there's a transition there as well, like this music starting to get sold and really put out there in a different way. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, that's especially relevant and kind of easy to trace in dance culture, because that had been very aristocratic in the 18th century. So dancing of the kind of ballroom dance type was something that only aristocrats really did. But then when the ballrooms were open to the public in Vienna, I mean, stuff was happening differently in different parts of Europe. But in Vienna, that meant that what had been an aristocratic private place suddenly became basically a middle class mixed place. And that kind of takes power away from the aristocracy. And the way you can see them responding to that is they stop going to those and then they go to their own things. And so they become increasingly withdrawn from public life while, you know, ostensibly everything is opening up. But they had to reinforce that divide somehow, otherwise they're going to be completely irrelevant. But when things, open up to the public, the ballrooms opened up to the public, and at the same time, Vienna becomes a real hub of music printing. Dozens of publishers are springing up within just 20, 30 years. That becomes the dominant cultural force. And so the Congress of Vienna is a really interesting moment when that middle class public world had really developed a life of its own. And then you have all of these monarchies trying to figure out where do they fit into all of that. And they can either not participate or they can do something new. I mean, what they can't do is dance a minuet in the middle of one of these balls, because that's not relevant anymore. You can't make that work in the new public environment. So what they had to do was kind of something a little bit more in keeping with the spirit of this commercialized world of the public ball. And I think the Polonaise is a pretty good example of what they came up with.
Awesome. All right. Do you have some questions on the screen, which you can probably pick up as well, and then we'll see. In fact, they keep going now. So now you got a whole bunch there.
Yeah. So first of all, from John Dryden. Hi, John. Why did they play Handel instead of a contemporary composer? Yeah, great question. That's another talk. Why not Beethoven is my question, but it's interesting. You'd think Vienna is the city of Beethoven, but actually the court established it cultivated its own music culture, which was separate and not as long lasting in terms of the kind of music history of the period. So that just throws up the different values in music. So they were interested in Handel because it's old. Also, it happens to be an oratorio that you can have giant forces. So there was, I think, 700 people in the choir or something like that. So yeah, that's that. And then next question, did the Polonaise fall out of favor in favor of the waltz? The Polonaise never really matched the waltz. The waltz was kind of the main dance. The Polonaise was just a processional dance that was ceremonial at the beginning of a ball. And so they kind of went hand in hand with each other. But the waltz was definitely the heart and soul of dance culture. Okay, should I keep going? Questions?
Really, with the volume in here. Yeah.
So I'm curious about the music that was sold. Did everyone know how to play an instrument? And was the music written for different kinds of instruments? I was actually intrigued by listening to the Polonaise as you played it. It was on a piano. how did that large orchestra play? I mean, I was just sort of intrigued about the whole music piece of it.
Yeah. So the first thing you said, did everyone play the piano? Yeah. Middle class people did, especially in this period. Pianos were becoming mass produced and there was a lot more people with disposable income. So this was kind of a golden age for music making at home. And music printing was becoming cheap and easily available. So this is the 1800s version of music streaming or whatever, you know, you can kind of take the music home and do it yourself. And dance music like this Polonaise would be usually performed by a large orchestra, so that's composed for all of these individual parts, but you're not going to sell that because that's a lot of work for a short piece that's going to go out of fashion like 5 minutes later. So usually what happened was that there would be a whole bunch of new music performed for each new season. Apparently the ball orchestras would have rehearsals and they would actually have to bring the music in a wheelbarrow because there was so much music. But that music usually didn't survive. Some of it still survives in Vienna, but there was usually only one copy that the orchestra played. But you could very cheaply create a little transcription and sell lots of copies of that. So it's a nice commercial venture. It's easy for composers to write a lot of dance music and make a quick buck. Then it's easier than writing a symphony. So Mozart did it for money, and Beethoven as well.
Do you know whose brilliant idea this was to restore the monarchy by having this royal processional and we dance and you watch? And does we credit anybody with this idea of reestablishing this divide?
So I think it actually originated, I'm not entirely sure, but the Congress of Vienna wasn't the first time that the monarchs had all got together after Napoleon's defeat. They'd already met somewhere in Germany. They'd gone to London in the summer. And Tsar Alexander apparently introduced the Polonaise. And so that was they were already doing that themselves. No, where they met. So they definitely met in London. Alexander went to London, I think in June. Somewhere in Germany, I don't forget. But basically before the Congress of Vienna, there was a few other meetings and they were planning what are we going to do when we get together. So it was kind of already a thing for them. But some genius had the idea of making this part of this this public ball. So probably originally Tsar Alexander, but I don't know how it got to the ceremonial stage.
Do you want to pick up some of the questions there then?
Yeah. Okay, this is from Sarah Mills. Does the fact that the Polonaise originated from Poland, Prussia, Russia, and was influenced by Tsar Alexander have relevancy in the cultural politics? Yeah, because Poland was a contested land mass at this time. Russia really wanted it. Prussia also really wanted it. So that picture I showed you of the monarchs with a map cutting bits off of what they want. Poland is this kind of yeah, it's not great to be Polish in this period because everyone wants a piece of you. So Tsar Alexander performing the Polonaise probably comes with a bit of a sense of ownership. You know, this is my culture. So perhaps there's some political undertones there too.
Other questions from the audience? Just want to make sure we let the folks. I think we can keep going through there.
Keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's a question. So the Congress of Vienna wanted to reinstate an aristocracy. Yes, I mean, aristocracy didn't ever go away in some parts of Europe, but the big problem was France, which had become a republic, and that made all of the other European nations anxious because they're all thinking that they're going to get overthrown. But after Napoleon's defeated, that's a kind of moment for all of these aristocratic powers to get together and, you know, let's set the tone so that this doesn't happen again. Okay, next question. Had the Polonaise been danced in the era of the minuet, or was it wholly invented for the Congress of Vienna? So it had been danced before. It was already very popular in Poland and Russia. It's probably of 18th century origins, I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely a court dance that was known elsewhere, just not really in Vienna's public dance culture yet. And then the next question, what were the movement differences between waltzes and polonaises? And was the waltz a faster 3/4 tempo? The polonaise is slightly slower, actually. The polonaise is really meant for walking to. And there's different flavors of Viennese waltz in this period. There's slow ones and fast ones, but the fast ones are quite fast. Okay, and the next question, how did this shift in Austria influence other countries and cultures? I presume that's about the dance culture, and that was very influential. The Congress of Vienna, you can see that that's the moment after which the waltz gets introduced in England. So there's a instruction book on how to dance the waltz published in 1816, just a year after the Congress. Yeah, very important moment for Viennese dancing across Europe. And then as music and dance evolved in the 18th century and were intertwined with the development of government, do you see how these were reflected in the art that was being produced at the time? Yeah, I mean, I suppose the big development in the 19th century is that the political power no longer has the same direct influence over art that it did when the aristocrats had all the money and the power. So now when you have a commercial world, composers and artists can start to make their own money without being employed by some rich dude who's going to pay for whatever they want. So that's probably the main development. And that's where Beethoven is such an important figure in music, because he's one of the first that really composed music on his own terms. And there's things that you can see in Beethoven's music that his predecessors just couldn't do because of the kind of economic and social situations that they were living in. And then from John Dryden, what was the influence of dance culture on European powers after 1848? Well, that's way after my period.
That's an unfair question. That's pure conjecture.
Yeah.
Anyone? I see another hand up here. Okay. Maybe the last question, just sort of run out of time.
So you mentioned the instruction book from 1816. So I'm wondering, there's another way that the Viennese public learned the Polonaise, since this was new to them. Did they suddenly start including it in dancing schools, or was there another way they learned how to do this dance? Yeah,
this is something that's really frustrating to me about trying to study dancing in Vienna. Vienna in the early 19th century was basically the most famous city for dancing. And it was also the most famous city for music publishing. So there was tons of things being printed. But for some reason, they didn't print dance things. So all of the dance instruction books that we have from this period are not from Vienna. And a lot of them are imitating Vienna's dance culture. And they're saying this is how they do it in Vienna. But I would take all of that with a massive pinch of salt, because I think Viennese dance culture had a life of its own, and it's something that people learned in dancing schools and just by doing it. I mean, the waltz is something that kind of just developed by itself. Yeah, the frustrating thing about that is that it's never going to be possible to say exactly what a waltz looked like in 1800, because we don't have an instruction book telling people how to do it. All we have is instruction books from other places and people describing what's happening in Vienna, and music. There's lots and lots of music.
Awesome. Well, I think we should look to introduce the Polonaise maybe into the president's investiture and the cabinet, and all the deans can learn it and sashay in, you know, what do you think? Should we do it? All right. I'll talk to the president. I'm sure she'll buy right in. Let me thank Erica very much for a fantastic talk, for all of you being here. Many people online as well, and lots of great questions. Thank you for being here. I think do we have one more this semester coming up? We have one more coming up in April, I believe. Yep. So one more of this University Lecture Series. And again, one more round of applause for Erica for a fantastic talk. Thank you.